Welcome to the Meru Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media Podcast. I'm your host, Mukunda Raghavan, and today I'm joined by the illustrious Dr. Ruth Vanita. She's a professor, and she has written quite a few books connected to Dharma. Her newest book is Dharma of Justice, and she's written works for Manushi magazine, and she's written a lot of academic papers dealing with Hinduism, feminism, the LGBTQ experience within the diaspora and generally Indians, but also in relation to the text. So, Dr. Vanita, welcome so much to the program. Namaste, namaskar. Dr. Vanita, could you tell us a little bit about like your background? So where are you from originally, and how did you get into wanting to study this kind of stuff?
I grew up and was educated entirely in Delhi, in India, and moved here to the US late in life. I still go back to India at least once and often twice a year and spend as much time as I can. I guess I began with my interest began with Manushi. I volunteered on it for 13 years while teaching at Delhi University. And we did this special issue on Bhakti poetry and another special issue on goddesses. And I did a lot of research for that, and a lot of reading. And that's when I got drawn into Hindu philosophy and Hindu sacred narrative. After that, when I worked on same-sex love in India, which is this book, I was entirely responsible for the ancient and medieval Sanskritic parts of it. So I read the entire Mahabharata and many of the Purans and many other texts, and then that's where I got really drawn in.
Sure.
Discovered many wonderful things I didn't expect to find.
So what part of India are you from originally?
I'm from Delhi. My parents are from different parts of the country. So I'm like part Bengali, part Gujarati, part half Tamil. And,
okay. So did you what was your undergrad and graduate school in? I mean, was your experience there directly connected to the work you did later in your life?
In a way, I think it equipped me, that and Manushi equipped me to do the later work, because I did a BA, not a BA English honors, not majoring in English as most people majored in something. I did what is called a BA pass at that time, which is a general BA. And in that, my subjects were English, but also Hindi. Mm-hmm. And that gave me more of a grounding in Hindi than just the school level Hindi. And then also Indian philosophy. Philosophy was my third subject, in which there was both Indian and Western philosophy. So that was another thing. So then my MA and PhD were in English, yeah.
In English. So what did you get acquainted with Sanskrit at that? Was it self-taught, or did you learn from someone?
My Sanskrit I took later, much later. I took a couple of years with the great Madhav Deshpande at Michigan, and that was just, of course, you need 12 years of study to really be fluent, which I don't have. I won't say that I'm fluent, but I can manage.
Sure.
I can reading certain kind of Sanskrit, not Vedic Sanskrit, but epic Sanskrit and Puranic.
Sure.
Yeah.
When were you teaching at Delhi University? I was actually at Delhi University for 1 year in education abroad back in 2000. I don't know if you were there.
I had left by then. So I taught first at Miranda House, and then I started teaching at the age of 20. That time you could do it when you finish the MA. So I taught first at Miranda House, then at the English department, Delhi University, and I came to the US to this job, I should say, in 1997. Yeah.
And you've been here since? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then I keep going back and forth. So now I've just retired last year, so I can spend more time in India.
Oh, so you don't have any active professorship now?
No.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's talk, if we can we go through kind of the journey of your work, because Dharma is a big subject, right? So but you were kind of touching upon it from your work starting in Manushi and then your same sex. It was like these threads you were picking up upon back then. So can you start picking up those threads? Yeah, go ahead, please.
After this book, then I wrote this book, 2005, Love's Rite, and it's about same-sex marriage, which at that time was not at all on the agenda. In fact, homosexuality was still criminalized in India. But what I was doing was that from 1980 onwards, I'd been collecting these newspaper clippings of these young, non-English speaking, low-income young women, mostly women, few men, all over the country, who either married by Hindu religious rites, or else they committed joint suicide, which is not a phenomenon common outside India. And there are hundreds of them. It's still going on. This is still going on. They had no connection with any movement, but they chose this language of marriage and the language of death. So in this book, I also looked at the legal, the religious, the literary background in Sanskrit and Hindi and Bengali and other texts, Urdu texts, which I suggested gave the language to these women. Not that they had read these texts, but that these ideas are there, especially say the idea of rebirth. So I focus on the idea of rebirth, because many of these women in the suicide note say that we will be reborn. In this life, we are not allowed to be together, but in the next life, we will be together.
Right.
And then I also interviewed priests who had performed some of these marriages, who also said the same thing, that in a previous life, they would have been connected in some way, hence this strong feeling they have for each other now. Otherwise, why would they go against social disapproval to do this?
Sure.
Then I also found in the 11th century Katha Sarit Sagar stories of what is now called caste, intervarna marriage and interclass marriage, where again the same doctrine is given, that the same idea is given, that they were connected in a former birth. And this applies both to love and to friendship. They were connected in a former birth. And there are stories of the same-sex unions between two men and two women in the Katha Sarit Sagar, where they say, why do we feel like this for this person? And it must be because we're connected in a former birth. And there's much more to say, but it's complex. But so now that marriage equality petitions are in the Indian Supreme Court, the Penguin has issued a commemorative 35th for their 35th year new edition of this book. Yeah, then in 2005 also I wrote another collection of essays. I put together my essays called Gandhi's Tiger and Sita's Smile. I looked at various, it wasn't just same-sex sexuality, it was other things. For example, I looked at the Adbhut Ramayana, and Sita's Smile comes from there, where Sita is this goddess who is much more powerful than Rama, but chooses not to display her powers. She defeats 100-headed Ravana. She is, instead of weeping all the time, which is what we often associate with Sita, she is laughing and smiling the way the goddess is. And it's again, anyway, so it's a kind of coming together of the Vaishnava and the Devi traditions, Shakta tradition. So that's an example of one text that I looked at. I also looked at descendants of the Kama Sutra, other texts like the Ananga Ranga. So in the Kama Sutra, there is a chapter on desire between men, but there's very little on women. But the Ananga Ranga removes all the same-sex stuff, but does talk about female orgasm and the clitoris in just beautifully, stunningly beautiful ways and with wonderful metaphors and so on. So I also wrote about that. So those are some examples of things I wrote about in that collection of essays.
So before we continue forward, let's spend a little bit of time here. So a lot of, because your work was so focused on not just sexuality, but female sexuality and the LGBT same-sex kind of world, can you give us a general gloss of what your reading of the texts were, right? Like historically, if we can talk about, like, say, ancient India to medieval India, like what are these themes of, because we hear constantly how patriarchal the systems are, and I'm not saying it's not, but I am saying that there are clearly undercurrents that display either a reaction or counter-revolution to the overall patriarchal ideas. But so can you talk about this a little bit?
Well, every society is patriarchal. There's nothing especially, it's not there's some of us have this feeling of our patriarchy is better than yours. I don't think so. Every society, patriarchy is like the air we breathe. There's no society outside patriarchy. So I don't really focus on that. I focus on the specific. And the specific point that we found in same-sex love in India and that I've written about in many later books is that in India, same-sex desire was never unspeakable the way it was in the West. It was never punishable, not even under Muslim kings. And it was openly flourishing, openly talked about in a range of tones, from mild disapproval to celebration. So there was the whole spectrum of attitudes. It's there in the Mahabharata, it's there in the Kama Sutra, and there's a continuous, these days in the academy, we focus on discontinuities. And there are, of course, many discontinuities, but my focus is more on continuities, which tend to be overlooked. So this ancient medieval cut up, when you're writing in a particular language, say in Sanskrit, I think there is a continuity. The later writers are aware. I'll give you one example. So in the 14th century Krittivas Ramayana, in some versions of the Krittivas Ramayana, I should say, which is in Bengali, and another Bengali text, the Padma Puran, the Bengali recension of it, there is the story of two co-widows who their husband dies and then they are queens, and they Now, different versions are there in the different stories, but basically they fall in love with each other, and in some versions they're actually instructed by the gods to do so. And with divine blessing, they have sex and they produce a child who is Bhagiratha. Now, this story of Bhagiratha's birth is only in the Bengal text, as far as I know. Everywhere else, it's not. It's narrated differently. So he's the child of two mothers who are co-wives. And I find co-wifehood and co-widowhood a very interesting space where the two women have a union that is kind of lifelong. You are married to the same man, so you are living together. And are you also married to each other? This is one question.
Very interesting.
Many texts, in Sanskrit texts and Urdu texts and many texts. So anyway, in these Bengali texts, then Bhagiratha, the author says, the poet says, why is he named Bhagiratha? There's more to it, but I'm not going to tell the whole story, because he is born of enjoyment between two bhagas. Bhaga, of course, has hundreds of meanings in Sanskrit, but he picks up the meaning bhaga means vulva. And this is a folk etymology. It may not be correct, but it's very interesting that he thinks of that and he says that this is what it is. He's foregrounding that love between the women. I have not come across in any other literature of that period in the world two women producing a child together. And I think this is a fantastic idea, partly related to the whole idea of the goddess as producing beings from herself. You know, there's so many stories of the goddess in battle who produces beings from herself. So the goddess of the earth is reproductive in herself. So, and of course, males also produce, man also produces children together. There are many examples of that. So what I'm saying is there is a creative imagination in India, which in which you have all this flowering of all these different stories and the imagination which is unafraid to go anywhere. And I'm very often asked to tell stories from Hindu mythology about what I don't like, about same-sex desire or whatever. And the point is that these sacred narratives, these stories are manifestations or illustrations of philosophy. And the basic philosophical premise that the spirit is without gender. That's also an idea cited by many priests and many of these women who got married to each other in 20th century India. The spirit is without gender. There is rebirth. And the gods and goddesses are not simply male or female. When there's the praise of Shiva in the Mahabharata, I am male, I am female, right? So the God of Krishna and the Gita is everything. So everything is a manifestation. We don't have absolute ideas of evil and good. Everything is malleable, changing all the time. And as far as categories like gender or sexuality or race or national, all of these things are temporary, transient, and passing, and they change from lifetime to lifetime, and in the same lifetime as well. So I wrote another essay in Gandhi's Tiger about this debate between Saulabha and Janaka, which you may have come male and female sage, and I've elaborated on that in the latest book. And where she says, look at the body. Every cell in it is changing all the time. Every atom in it is changing all the time, which we know to be scientifically true. And you don't notice the change because it is like a flickering of a flame. You don't see that it is changing, but it is changing all the time. And in Hindu thought, the mind, the brain, is also part of the body. So you have the body and the self, but you don't have the body-mind divide that you have in Cartesian philosophy. So the mind is also changing every minute. It's changeable. There's no such thing as a static mind. And therefore, what is the difference between two beings? They are expressions of the same Atman, the same universal self, and they also have the same bodies. Right. So to think that one is superior to the other in some ultimate sense, of course, there is a hierarchy, but that hierarchy is also not fixed. It is always changing. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I think those are fascinating threads because these are some of the issues that still crop up today, right? Like we're, 2,000 years, 1,000 years from the time of say 1,000 years from the time of the Adhyatma Ramayana or Adbhuta Ramayana, right? And these themes are still playing out today. Like we still have these conversations. So a question, I don't know if you did work on this, is do you think these stories, these narratives are merely creative exposition, or do you think they reflect a kind of understanding of the reality or social mores in the day that when they're writing, or is it like a counter-revolution? I mean, yeah.
It's both, I think, as any literature in the world is. It's not, again, unique. I think I agree with Percy Shelley, the English poet, who says that the poets imagine something beyond. So, for instance, in the story of the two women who produce a child, now these authors would have seen many co-wives raising children together, like Rama calls all his mothers as mothers, right? So they are familiar with the idea of having more than one mother. Now, the imaginative part of it is to think, what if the two women who are raising the child, they could also produce the child together? Then what would happen, right? So, and another very interesting thing when I mentioned about continuities is that this story goes back, there's a base for it 14 centuries earlier. In the Charaka Samhita, which is around 1st century AD or BC, that 1st century to 1st century, that in that book, there is a medicalization of same-sex desire and even reproduction. It says if two women have sex together and by some chance, this is what it says, by some chance, their sexual fluids mingle and one of them becomes pregnant, then she will give birth to a child which will be blood and flesh but no bones, because the father contributes the hard parts of the body, the bones, the hair, the nails. And in one of these Kritivas Ramayana versions of the story, the child is born without bones as a mass of flesh, and the mothers are distraught and they say, what is the use of having such a child? It's totally what we would call disabled. Then they go and leave it by the side of the river. They leave it. And then comes along Ashtavakra, a fascinating figure about whom I have written more than one essay. And he sees the child and thinks that it is mimicking him because he's disabled. Right?
Yeah.
So he gives a curse that either if you are mimicking me, then stay like this forever. But if you are really like this, you are a mass of flesh, then become beautiful like god of Kama. And of course, that's what happens to Bhagirath. But what I'm interested in is that this 14th century text is referring to that earlier text. Clearly, there's familiarity with this idea of two women having a child. That idea is already there in the tradition, in Charaka Samhita, that two women can have a child together. But this author, now living in the ambience in Bengal, in the ambience of Shakti, of goddess power, the power of Shakti, reinterprets that image of monstrosity as a miracle. You know, the gods come and they intervene and they make the child beautiful. In different Brahmas involved, Shivas involved, various gods are involved, Kamas involved. So, yeah.
No, I mean, that's fascinating because, I mean, I think it shows, for example, that these poets or these authors were very well read in many different disciplines, right? Because to pull out an obscure kind of phrase from Sharaka when you're just a poet is very, very interesting to me. And it shows they probably had some exposure to these texts. But it also shows like there's, you know, the sense of self is much more malleable than we think about today, right? Like, you know, like not that we think about today, but what we thought about the past, because so much of we think about Hindu thought is really, again, I think it's very a colonized version of what we think about ourselves in some sense, right? So,
really, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so when we go to same sex, like, do you have a sense that, you know, like the Greeks engaged in, you know, pedastry, the Romans also tend to have a little bit of homosexual kind of like society part of them. Was India open to that in like, say, roughly the same period, or was it much more closed off? I mean, when do we start having these social mores become really, really ossified?
The change comes in the British period, in the 19th century, I think primarily after 1857. Before that, the British are more scattered in the sense in their attitudes to these things. There are Europeans who are happy to find all these different forms of sexuality flourishing in India, whether it's polygamy or polyandry or courtesan. But when the crown takes over after the Great Revolt in 1857, then they passed the anti-sodomy law in 1861, which has just been overturned in 2018, right? So, and that is when legally, administratively, not just same-sex desire, but all kinds of things like courtesans, about whom I've written a book, get reclassified as sex workers. They were actually female intellectuals, and they gradually outlaw polygamy, and then Indian nationalists of all stripes, from left to the extreme right. And we often think these are polarities. I'm more interested in what always people share. And
Sure.
They all share this idea that, yes, all these types of sexuality are bad, and we were always heterosexual and monogamous, so that's what we were in the ancient past, and that's what we will be. So everybody, in that 100 years, you can see the change happening. For instance, in this book, which is about Urdu poetry, in the 1820s, these poets, a whole range of major poets, not just minor ones, were writing poetry about male-female relations, male-male relations, and female-female relations in the same tones, in exactly the same tones, playful, humorous, romantic, sad, etc. And they were including these in their collected works. Now, at this time in England, Lord Byron, to take an example, exact contemporary, was changing all the pronouns in his poems to men. So that was the difference in atmosphere, because in England, you could be executed for that, right?
Sure.
Then 100 years later, in 1920s, when this Hindi nationalist writer Pandey Bechan Sharma Ugro, whose works are translated, when he writes a book called Chocolate about male desire, and he writes it in a very negative tone, despite that, the whole Hindi literary world descends on him, and it's the first public debate on homosexuality in India, I think. And all says this topic should never be mentioned in polite society. Even if you're trying to condemn it, it should never be. In this 100 years, it becomes unspeakable. Basically, that's all there is to it. This debate around him went to Gandhi. Even Gandhi, first said the book is okay, and then later condemned it. And there's one story behind that. So, yeah.
I mean, this is so fascinating that how these parts, it shows both like this inherent fragility in our social engagement with each other and social acceptance, because 100 years or 150 years, it seems as if 3,000 years of traditions and history and ideas of what's acceptable sexually have suddenly been overturned and like oppressed in some ways, right?
Not entirely.
Okay.
Traditions still continue. They don't entirely. They may go underground. Like all this literature that was written, this Urdu literature, I had to go and get it out of manuscripts. It disappeared in print, right? So it was it was not in print. It was about whatever was a little bit was in print was all bowdlerized. There were dot wherever they thought it was. Right. So things like that. Not just, I think it's not just Urdu, it would other languages too. So it doesn't disappear entirely. It resurfaces, I think, in film songs. A lot of the playful songs you have in Hindi films, Jaane Kahan, Mera Jigar Gaya Ji, that kind of ghazal. We think of the ghazal as a very gloomy, sad thing, but it's not. But peppy, happy, playful ghazal is also there in Hindi movies. So many things go into, the courtesans themselves went into Hindi movies and were the first women in Hindi movies. So many things go into Hindi movies, and that happens in Tamil as well, where courtesans go and work in Tamil cinema. So it does remain, but yes, we are under colonial rulers. So it's not just that it's fragile, it's that in fighting against the colonial rulers after the 1857 defeat, I think that's very important. After the defeat of 1857 revolt, both Hindu and Muslim elites, I think the men, felt shattered. Their cultures were shattered. Their towns were literally shattered. Delhi and Lucknow were literally remade. And their cultures, and they felt that they have been defeated. Because they have been defeated, there must be something wrong with their cultures. Many have, beginning with Ashish Nandi. And therefore, they tried to remake themselves in the image of the conqueror in order to fight back against the conqueror, which they did successfully. Right. So Arya Samaj, Pratya, all those people, all the social reformers, and then the nationalists, the Gandhi, the communists, etc., Bhagat Singh in his hat and all that, they all tried themselves, like the colonials, to fight against them, right? And they do it, but at a cost. And the cost is losing touch with many aspects of your own culture, not all of it, but many aspects of it. The aspects that are under attack by the colonialists. Things like worshipping images, which in English is called idolatry, which has a negative connotation. Right? Yet all of this and you internalize it. We all grew up with this in our English educated people, especially, but even other educated in other languages too. So,
I mean, in this context, like, did you also notice when in your studies, like, was there any difference between, say, pre-1857, was there any real difference between Hindus or Muslims in talking about sexuality, or was it pretty much openly done across the board?
No, that's the interesting thing. All the poets that I was referring to, they're all Muslim men, and they all consider themselves, practicing Muslims and everything. They didn't seem to see any contradiction between writing about pleasure and play and sex and male sex and female sex. They didn't seem to, or male-female sex even outside of marriage. They didn't seem to find any contradiction, and their readers were very happy, and the kings were very happy. Their patrons were very happy. So in the Muslim kingdoms, homosexuality is flourishing. These are not the only poems. Virtually every male poet writes about male love. Female love is unique to this kind of poetry that I wrote about. But male love is everywhere. It's a convention. It's a literary convention. Even if you're not practicing it, you write about it. Sure. And of course, there's plenty of prose accounts, which we have in same-sex love in India, of about what was going on in the bazaars and the courts, etc. So Salim Kidwai wrote about that stuff. And I learned Urdu in order to read this poetry because I knew it was something special. So there was, despite the Quranic prohibition and so on, Indian Muslims, I can't say about Muslims elsewhere, were happily practicing and writing about. The ideas were circulating. Akbar was, interestingly, was the one emperor who tried to issue a farman to his nobles to not saying that he disapproves of male desire and that they should stop it. Nobody paid any attention, and he didn't. to enforce, and it just went on and flourished. Yeah. So I think the real shift comes with British colonialism.
Now, do we also have quite a bit of information as to, or about women's voices in this time period? You know, say the medieval to early modern period about these kind of topics, or no? Or was it just because women didn't write much?
Well, the Bhakti poets don't write about same-sex desire exactly, but they write about other types of desire, you know, sublimated, I mean, not sublimated, I don't like that word, but desire generally. They write openly and explicitly, whether it's Andal or whether it's Mirabai or it's Mahadevi Akka, whoever, right? And about the gender being fluid, etc. Mahadevi Akka writes about that. And other male poets also write. See, women, for instance, women wrote this type of Urdu poetry, but it's all disappeared. So very little has actually survived. So, and that is by male poets. I'm not really focused on that much interested in who was writing,
Sure.
or whether what we would call homosexual or heterosexual. These are all modern categories. We don't know what they were doing. I'm interested in the ideas that were in circulation. If the idea is in circulation for a long period of time and over vast spaces, it means that they aren't all imagining all of this. We know for sure they aren't all imagining all of this. And these poets, the Urdu male poets, for example, say that they got these ideas from women. They had women interlocutors, I think mostly courtesans, who were their friends. And these women, and there are words, there are actually many words like dogana, zanahi, etc., for same-sex love, desire between women, for the couples who form. There's one poet who gives a description of two women getting married among their female companions. He uses the word shadi and the ritual that they perform. So I think it's happening. Women just don't write as much, or what they write disappears on this side. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't. And there's also a British administrator who gave a report to Havelock Ellis. Havelock Ellis was a sexologist who was collecting information. And this British officer actually gives him information about actual women he knew, two widows who were living together, two women in the jail. And he knew that there were same-sex female couples. So that's like...
I mean, when I read your work and I read some of these primary sources sometimes, it's a shock to me, honestly, like, because, you know, like in India, even now I go, unless you're in a big city, right, unless you're like in Delhi or Bangalore or Mumbai, like these topics or even engaging in this is kind of like blasé. I mean, not blasé, it's kind of like looked down upon, right, as if like this is not something to discuss.
That's because we are so, on the contrary, I would say in this book, in Love's Rite, all the women, female couples I look at, and some male couples, they're all non-English speaking villages, poor people, low-income groups. They're fishermen, they're Dalits, they're fisherwomen, they're Dalits, they're tribals, they're farmers' daughters, they're...
Interesting.
They're all non-metropolitan, non-English speaking. And now their voices, speaking of voices, you can even hear their voices on YouTube. There's a couple of girls, Abhilasha and Deepshikha, from, so where earlier we only had press reports, these girls actually in a video on YouTube where you can hear them in absolutely village Hindi. They're in a part of UP in a village, and they're talking about how they want to be together. They are not interested in men, and they went and garlanded each other in front of the registry office, but their marriage couldn't be registered. And they say that we want the government to give us employment and help us and give us rights, the same rights as other citizens. So they are not waiting for it to come from the Supreme Court or from, they are just doing it.
But I mean, society-wise, I mean, how does society react to it? How does, like, it's not, I mean, people always,
one of their fathers supported them. That's the interesting thing about it. From the 1980 onwards, many times, the first famous one was in 87, when Leela and Urmila, these two policewomen in Madhya Pradesh, in a small town, Madhya Pradesh, got married, and then they were dismissed from the police force. So that's society's reaction. But the other reaction is that Urmila's family in the village organized a wedding reception for them to console them. And this is 1987, much before there's marriage equality anywhere in the world. And then 1990, sometime in the 1990s, two nurses get married in Patna, in a goddess temple, the Mahamaya temple, and there are 200 guests, and their family of one of the women is there, who organizes the wedding, that Jaya gets married to a woman and Jaya's sister gets married to a man in the same wedding, the same priest, the same ritual. So I don't...
That's beautiful.
Society is only the chattering classes in the cities. The society is very varied in India.
Yeah.
Family to family attitudes differ. So while some families are very violent and try to kill, not exactly kill, but try to arrest the girls and separate them, and many of those forcibly separate them, marry them to There are others who, after a while, accept it and actually celebrate the wedding, as they do with other disapproved heterosexual weddings. There are plenty of heterosexual couples also committing suicide and running away and all that. And there are many families who come around and celebrate the wedding. The same as it's the same pattern. I don't think you're surprised by it at the local level.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about obviously the joint suicide, which is unique in, I guess, to the Indian, like let's say Kayamatak, and then there's movies in even South India, right? There's a Kamal Hassan movie where he kills himself along with it. It's a very interesting. The
11th century Sagar, where they're doing exactly that. They're committing suicide together. Yeah.
Wow. And is there in that text, is there some sort of theological reason for it? Do they think they die together, they are reborn in a place together?
Yes, in some, well, actually what they say is that if we can't be together, we are going to die together, and they do. And in some cases they actually do. In other cases, the parents prevent them, because the father has a dream. He's a king, and he has a dream in which he finds that how can my daughter, or I forget who is son or daughter, who is a royal family, son I think, wants to marry this extremely poor person who is from a different one and all that. So he dreams that in a previous life they were married, and then it legitimizes it. Then and then in another case, these two men who fall in love, they don't get married, but one of them falls in love with the other, I should say. One is a bandit, one is a merchant's son. And then they live together the rest of their life. The merchant's son gets married. So the wife is also living there, but the bandit who was a bandit doesn't get married. And at the end of life, due to remembering something in his rebirth, the merchant's son, Pulindika and Vasudatta, I think are their names, he jumps off a cliff. So his wife also jumps off the cliff, and his friend also jumps off the cliff.
Wow.
So there's a lot about sati. We know about sati and all that, but there are many instances of a man committing suicide to be with his male friend who is dead. And there is this idea that we'll be reborn together again in the next life. And this is what the girls in the 20th century are writing in their suicide notes. We couldn't be husband and wife in this life. We'll be together in the next life. Right.
Right.
So
right.
This idea in Indian culture, this idea of rebirth. And
right. And to briefly touch upon, you mentioned the courtesans, right? So we're, we'd say Devadasis, right? So, there's this I've noticed especially in South India, right? So I because of my connection to Tamil Nadu and whatever, I keep track of, also Carnatic music and dance and Bhakti. It's very interesting to see this new movement of people arguing that, these things or these traditions where they were all prostitutes, or they were of the nature where they were historically oppressed for thousands of years, and these traditions are imposed on them and so on. But again, when you read something, even like the Buddhist text or even the Hindu text, you find courtesans have a lot of power. Devadasis have a lot of power and autonomy. So can you speak a little about this?
Yeah, Devadasis there is recent work on that, but my book is about women in Lucknow, courtesans in Lucknow, who are called Tawaf. And I think are pretty typical of all of North India. There's evidence on Calcutta, there's evidence on Delhi. And these women were not sex workers. There were sex workers also who existed, but these were totally different. They lived in female-dominated households, I should say. They were what I would call female intellectuals, because the male poets write about them by name, praising their dancing, their singing, their conversation, their beauty, their intelligence, all of this. And they have the same patrons. The same patron who patronizes the male poets also patronizes these courtesans, many of whom were poets themselves. They perform in the same spaces. So the poet writes a poem in praise of a particular courtesan by name, and then the courtesan dances to that poem. So advertising. Wow. And these courtesans are in the highest income tax bracket in the 19th century, the only women in that highest income tax bracket. They owned property, and very often they got married in later life, which sometimes Hindi movies also show. Which I also wrote a book on courtesans in Hindi movies, which actually show them as, and there's a misconception that they're mostly Muslims. In fact, in the Hindi movies, they are majority Hindu, and that is true in life also, because the majority population was Hindu.
Right.
The movies correctly show them as, they do also keep lamenting about them as victims, but they also show them as agents. The first women in Hindi movies to own houses, to drive cars, to be filmmakers, which they were in real life. The first women to be self-employed and to adopt children, to form alternative families. You have these cases in several movies of a courtesan who leaves the trade and then lives with a man who she makes her brother, and they raise a child together. There's several movies of that kind. So, and I think a lot of this is reflective of these courtesans were working in the film industry. So these early directors, male directors and producers, they knew them as colleagues. And they were the first female producer and directors of films were courtesans. So of Hindi films. So, right, it's the British who categorize them as sex workers and turn some of them into sex workers by driving them out of their trade, but not all. Many of them go on to be poets, to be singers. We know, all the famous major classical singers who come from courtesan backgrounds, right? And they become singers. They go into movies, they go into theater, etc., etc. So yeah, that's another case of a group being stigmatized on the basis of sexuality, and the reality being lost sight of. So when you say Devadasi, it means a dasi, a slave of the gods. It doesn't mean it's like Tulsidas calling himself a das or Surdas or Mira.
Right.
All slaves, but they're not slaves. They are liberating themselves from the slavery of societal institutions, and then becoming slaves of God, which is a very different thing. Yeah.
So let me ask you: was there in the, say, we talk about Lucknow in North India, was the relationship, like Devadasis in the South were connected to temples and the temple administration, right? Which were in some ways patronized by kings. But how was the courtesans in the North, the Devadasis, were they connected to temples, or were they just connected to like courts?
They were connected to courts, but also to to wealthy families, business families, for example. They would go and perform in households, in business families, in courtiers, in nobility, and also in the royal court. And also most often in their own home, which is called the kota. They performed in their own home, and they had clients from all backgrounds, but basically wealthy backgrounds, who would come and engage in conversation. It's not just as in movies, they show them dancing and singing. They did that as well, but also engage in conversation about literature, about life, about eros, things that you couldn't discuss necessarily with women of your own family who might not be so educated. These were very highly educated women. There's evidence that they were reading the Kama Sutra, they were trained in Sanskrit, they were trained in Urdu, then Persian. They were highly accomplished and educated women, and that is what is lost sight of. And recent work also shows that Devadasis too performed in people's homes, not just in the temples. So, and Hindi movies do show I have a whole chapter on religion in this book, Dancing with the Nation, which shows how many of the women in Hindi cinema, the courtesans, are shown performing puja and going to the dargah. These two things, but particularly performing puja, huge numbers of them, and then are also compared to goddesses, a range of goddesses. Amar Prem is a good example of both these things.
So their education, like, was it because they were so self-sustained and they were able to, I mean, self-sustained meaning they had so many patrons and so on. They had their own built-in education system, and or did they have to go out to get educated? How did that?
They had tutors who came and taught them at home. So they who taught them the languages and taught them music, dance, and poetry at home. So it was all in the kota. It was the tutors came to them and taught them, and then it was also passed down from the mothers and aunts, and who may be biological or adopted, and passed down to the younger women. So I wrote a novel about this. I wrote this novel called Memory of Light.
Yes, I saw that just came out recently.
About two courtesans and then the entire world. So it's about their relationship, but then it's all about friendships and other relationships, and it's the entire little world. So
it's very fascinating to me because it seems such a dynamic like world of like where you get the sense that at least in some quarters, women had so much autonomy and so much power and so much ability to build their own separate society within a larger society, and that society was seen as being laudable, very like to be educated in literature is no small thing, right? At the end of the day, it's like it requires reading, it requires comprehension, it requires the ability to take concepts and themes and put them together. And literature really is I would say for me, it's the basis for what human beings are, right? Once we started being able to engage in narrative, we became human, in my view. But like it's a skill, or it's also an education that's been denied to millions of people at that time, I imagine, across the world.
Sure. And I don't give as much importance to education. I think a lot of people are very intelligent and also have a lot of knowledge of dharma and knowledge of tradition without being educated at all. And however, literature, yes, exposure to literature is not, everybody doesn't have that. Even educated people often go.
No, they don't. We see that often. A lot of people with STEM.
I just wanted to add that also Hindi movies, there's several major Hindi movies about courtesans in ancient India. So that's Hindu India. And there they do show the connection to the temple as well as the court. And these are they show both North Indian and South Indian. And there's some very famous movies of that kind, right? Showing them as warriors and various things. Just a few movies set in ancient India. So again, there is, with a lot of disjunction and discontinuity, there is a traditional an understanding of the Nagar Vadhu. She's the,
So on that point, I mean, so let's kind of shift in towards the new book Dharma, right? So this is the point I think you're touching upon, is to know Dharma in some sense. Like, we have the story of, what is it, Kaushika, and he first goes to the housewife and she doesn't come out in time. He gets upset, and then she sends him to Dharma Vyada. And so I mean, that story itself is indicative, or very to the point you're making, that you don't need to know literature or need to know these texts to know Dharma. So can you kind of give us a sense of what Dharma means in how you understood it through your, because it means 1,000 different things, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess the text, again, when you use the word dynamic, when I reread the Mahabharata, I discovered so many more narratives that I didn't know about. I hadn't noticed earlier because I was looking for something else. Depends on what I was looking for. And so apart from that famous story, there are many others in which, and I think most importantly in the Mahabharata, that the Shudras as teachers of Dharma. For example, Sanjaya, often overlooked as a very important teacher of Dharma. He actually teaches. He's named along with Vyasa, along with Vidura, along with Krishna, as a teacher of Dharma, and he does teach Dharma throughout the text. So he's a manual worker, he's a charioteer, he is technically a Shudra. Same is true of Vidura, who I think is not only a teacher of Dharma, and again with the same truth, but also in a way, I think the most virtuous person in the text, the sort of embodiment of Dharma. And he is, of course, an incarnation of the god Dharma, but just in his life too, in his actions, he does always the right thing, right? And so that's one way in which the text shows that Dharma is not about Varna, and it's not about birth, and it's not about education necessarily. It's about something else, about understanding. It's really about knowledge. It's about understanding the nature of the self and the nature of action and the nature of the world. Yeah.
No,
so I don't think, what I said is Dharma is not a set of moral precepts.
No.
It is based, I think, not on faith. It's based on knowledge. Often all religions are called faiths, and I don't think that it's about faith. It's about knowledge. Dharma is about knowing the nature of the world, understanding the nature of the self, of action, the nature of action, which is what Krishna says in the Gita, and understanding the nature of the world. These three things: the world, the action, and the self. And once you understand that, which you can do without books because you learn it from a guru, and you experience, once you make it, you realize it, make it a part of your experience, then you are, you are a teacher of Dharma. You can be a teacher of Dharma, or you're liberated, basically, right?
Yeah. I mean, no, please go ahead. No, I mean, for me, it's so fascinating for a variety of different reasons, because, like, Mahabharata is the text, for me, because at the end of the day, it's, people can read philosophy, read ethics, read, or go through those kind of academic exercises, but you won't learn about morality like if you don't read like the Brothers Karamazov or something like Mahabharata, right? These texts take these concepts and make it lived in a way that's just not abstract, where you're just intellectualizing things. And I think this is the beauty of the Mahabharata. It grounds its morality in human conditions.
Well, it's both, I would say. Yes, it's narrative, which demonstrates how Dharma is lived, but it's also a philosophical text. The Gita is a philosophical text, and not just the Gita. There's many parts of the Mahabharata, which is what I focus on, which are people debating. And these people could be sages, or very, very scholarly people, but they could also just be ordinary people who debate. Like, for instance, there's this wonderful debate between what we would call a banya, a grocer from the Vaishya Varna, who is debating with a Brahmin about violence, non-violence, vegetarianism, what we would now call veganism even, and all of this. I was amazed to find these questions raised there of, should we drink the milk of cows, and what about the calves, all these things. So when the Mahabharata says everything that exists is here, and if it is not here, it does not exist, I think there's something to that, because there are all these things that I was really surprised by. And so it is philosophical. There's also abstract philosophy being debated, often grounded in everyday life, but often not also. It's just also thinking about it. Like when Yudhishthira debates Varna, and he connects it to life, because he says we are all mixed Varna. How do you know what Varna you really are? oh, all the women in your lineage and all the men whom they slept with, obviously people are always sleeping with other people of other varnas. And so you don't know really your varna. Everything is mixed, and all actions, as Krishna says in the Gita, all actions are mixed too, right? There's no perfectly good action and perfectly bad action. They all have some mixture. Similarly, people too and all beings are mixtures of things.
Yeah, which is, so that point on Yudhishthira is very interesting, because the underlying story of the text itself is the reason for the Mahabharata occurs because of Parashurama's genocide of the Kshatriyas. So the women had to go interbreed with different castes, right? So like even the nature of this authentic lineage of kingship of the Kurus itself is in question. So it's I think it's, for me, there's that point, and then there's also the point that and I was going to connect this to, the conversation within I think it's Kaushika or Vishwamitra, I forget, with the Chandala, right? After the famine, he goes, but the idea of the philosophy is grounded in a real world situation that they're putting themselves in.
And there's this wonderful story. I mean, it's a bit extreme of a story, but I think it makes a point, a very important point, which is the story of Uttanka.
Yeah.
Right? Who gets a boon from Krishna that he can ask for what he wants, and then he asks for water when he's in the desert.
Beautiful story.
A hunter comes who is as sort of would be considered really low in terms of both his occupation and his.
I think they said Chandala in the text.
Yeah, Chandala, and surrounded by his dogs. So he's, and then he's urinating and asks him to come and drink that water. Now we know, of course, that if you are dying of thirst, you will drink urine. But despite that, Uttanka says he's horrified and he refuses. And then when Krishna comes, he says, like, how could you insult me by giving me this when I ask for water? And Krishna prahassa neva, which is the same term used in the Gita, as if smiling, says that this was Shiva and he was giving you the nectar of immortality, but if you had agreed to take it, but you didn't take it. So it shows that you are not liberated. You haven't seen that all the things are mixtures and all are the same. You are perceiving things in categories. So you're not really liberated.
Yeah, and he says the four dogs are the four Vedas, right? And the four Vedas were there, and the urine was Amrita, and then so I think it was fascinating because that story is also connects, I think, to the larger part of, even when you're dying of thirst, you're still thinking of these class and caste categories, right?
Right. And my first chapter in this book is on the Gita. And often, that women have any role in the Gita, it's overlooked that women and gender are important. But it's very important because in the first two chapters, when Arjuna is objecting to fighting, one of his main objections is that if the men are killed, then what will happen? Who will the women marry? And the women will have to marry out of the Varna, and then there'll be general societal confusion. And also we won't be able to offer, our children won't be there to make offerings to the ancestors because they won't know who the ancestors are when it's mixed varna. And so the whole will go to hell and the whole cosmos will come to a mess. Now, Krishna never directly answers the question. But throughout the Gita, he demonstrates to Arjuna that everything is mixed, that if you can't even possess your own body and your own actions, that those actions themselves are made by the universe, not only by you. And then how can you control whom is going to marry? Obviously, you can't control that, and you shouldn't even want to control that. That possessiveness, to use your word of patriarch, Arjuna is a patriarch, and so he thinks he can control everybody's marriages, and a lot of damage is done by trying to control people's marriages, as we know in the Mahabharata. So Krishna indirectly is telling him that these are not what you should be focusing on,
right.
Not what you should be thinking of. And another point which I think is that Krishna moves him on from the family to seeing the world in terms of friendship. Their own friendship, which is the sort of anchor of the text, and also he repeatedly uses that term, which means a friend of all beings, right? So that is what the enlightened being is, a friend of all beings, and not just your own family. You don't put your family first, because Arjuna is so worried about killing his family members. But if your family members are really going to wreak havoc, should you be paying more attention to them, or should you be paying attention to the overall welfare of the society and the world? Yeah,
right. And this goes to that concept of sarvabhuta hiterata, right? Yeah. So for the sake for everyone, right? Yeah. So I absolutely. So I mean, I think this is the point. I think people miss that. Well, Arjuna does lament about this varna shamkara and the loss of caste and women. Krishna doesn't even talk about it. He doesn't even address it. It's as if it's a non-issue for him.
Well, I don't think so. I think he answers many things indirectly. And if Arjuna has understood the point of the Gita, and if we have understood it, then the answer is obvious, arising from
Sure.
what he says. If Krishna is everything, as he shows in the Vishwarupa, that if he is everything from the ant to the elephant, from the demons to the heroes,
Yeah.
and if you should be sarvabhuta hiterata, which means you should be immersed in the welfare of all beings, then why would you be focusing on killing your nephews or uncles or whatever, who were trying to kill you anyway earlier?
Right.
But also, if they win, and this is the other point, if they win, they would not only, knowing what we know of them, they would rape the women, they tried to rape Draupadi, they would kill a lot of people. So you are also defending other innocent people. And second and thirdly, if you understand that you don't have, I think the most important thing in the text is that you are not this ego, this individual. One point which I made was about Bhakti. Still the word in North Indian languages for person, and there's no separate word for individual. It's the word both for person and for individual. And it means expression. This is something I only realized while researching for this book. Vyakta still means expression. And Vyakti means an expression, one temporary expression or manifestation of the universal self, of the Atman. And so if that's all you are a manifestation, and a changing manifestation. You are not a fixed ego individual, right? So you are changing all the time. Then in that case, this over focus on whom can I kill, whom can I prevent from marrying the wrong person and all that is really the wrong thing. If you can't control your own actions and your own self, then because it is part of the universe, I did this is wrong, because the whole universe cooperated in making you do this, in bringing you to this moment, right? I often think of this, and I'm writing a book, and we say it's my book and I wrote it, but think of all the things that went into that.
Sure.
Everybody who taught you, everybody you interacted with, all the books you read, the people who made the paper, the people who published it, who printed it, all of these things. So the book belongs to the universe, as Tulsidas says at the beginning of the Ramcharitmanas. So similarly, if that is the case, then how can you be dictating to people whom they should marry? You can suggest it to them and help them, but you
Sure.
control the future and control whom they will marry, right? So,
and this is, that's the entire point of in the Gita, where Krishna says, Ishwara Sarva Bhutanam Hrideshu Ajratishti, right? He's sitting in the hearts of all beings, spinning them around like they're a top. But Krishna himself is doing it. They think they're the one acting, but it's in fact action itself is done by Krishna. So
Krishna is the universe. The universe is acting through you, right? My students are so perplexed by the idea of the Christian idea of free will. They're always saying, but where's free will and free of choice? So, yes, there is agency, and you need to have that notion of free will in order to act. But that means that the choice really, there's no such thing as an absolutely unconditioned and free choice. No. Right? So the whole universe is acting through you. And that requires a certain humility to submit to that, to realize that, I don't have an absolute choice of everything. It's my being comes from my parents, from my family, from my education, from everything I've, and so all of those things are acting through you. So
it's interesting because when we talk about free will like this, if I were to ask someone, okay, you have free will, I want you to dislike ice cream. Dislike it. It's just your own desires and wills you have no control over, right? So at the end of the day, it's the way I think about this is if I wake up in the morning, I'm just in a bad mood, everything changes. The way I behave would change fundamentally, no matter how much will I think I have, right? Because it's just conditioned.
That's a very good example of liking and disliking. Yeah.
But this is the nature of I think this is where the philosophy is so important within the Hindu context, and Buddhist too, right? In the same way, it's this idea that the karma itself, I think people fundamentally misunderstand karma as the comment to be oh, do you think this disabled person in this life caused their own problem? And you're that's not what karma is saying at all. It's saying there's a chain of events. There's a chain of events.
It just means action.
Yeah.
There's translation to think of it as fate. It literally means action even today in Indian languages, more not Indian language. Karma means action.
Yeah.
And so actions will have consequences. That's it, right?
Exactly. And the only addition would be actions and consequences span the soul's time, but that's a whole nother, a deeper conversation on that. So where do you, so we have this, I think the interesting conversation that you brought up also in the text is Saulabha's and Janaka's conversation, right? Can you kind of walk us through that? Because I think it's a beautiful one about the nature of assumptions in the first place and interactions between human beings. Yeah.
Well, for one thing, she's a female and she's a sage. And then she's a single woman. And then she's also a Kshatriya, who is where sages are supposed to be Brahmin. So when she comes to debate with Janaka, who's a philosopher king, and it has become almost a symbol of philosopher king, that name. When she comes to debate with him, he's surprised by these three things, because he thinks, what is her varna? Why is she talking to me? Is she a Brahmin? And then the most importantly, he thinks if she's a woman, she must be married. So the first question he asks is, whose are you? And where do you come from? And to whom do you belong? And she then gives this, and he says it quite rudely.
Yeah.
And then gives this very beautiful and very civilized answer. She's not rude back, where she basically says, what does the question mean? She analyzes the question. Who are you? I am the Atman and you are the Atman. So there's no difference between us. I am the body, I have the body and you have a body, and the bodies are non-different, right? And so then she gives this whole exposition of asking that question, who are you, is not a question for a liberated person to ask, because they are not just two people meeting, they're two philosophers discussing, right? And then similarly, to whom do you belong is another question. Who belongs to anyone? Then she analyzes him as a king. And this is the new element that I looked at in this book, which I hadn't looked in my earlier essay. She analyzes his power as a king. And she says, to whom do you think you're very powerful, basically, and you can control everyone? But actually, the king lives in fear that people will revolt against him.
Yeah.
Every decision he makes, they're criticizing. Somebody or other is criticizing. Nobody ever likes everything that he does. So what does the king actually own? What belongs to you, really? When you go to sleep, you have only one bed, and that too you have to share with your wife. When you eat, then you can only eat that much. So you think you own this, you share it. What does it really mean? Effectively, you don't really control everything. And effectively, you have to depute your power. People are doing other things, right? People are doing what they want. So, and they're doing things under your instructions, but they're also doing their own, adding their own thing to that, right? So that you're deluded about the nature of power and possession is basically what she's communicating to him, without saying it in that many words, by giving a very philosophical analysis of the nature of the self, of the nature of action, and the nature of what we imagine is possession, right?
Yeah, I also found fascinating in that dialogue that Janaka assumed that she wanted to be with him. Yeah. Or some sort of sexual reason, and she kind of just flips it on his head, so beautifully.
It's a very fascinating idea of yogic possession, that as a yogi takes possession of him, and then he feels as if he's being invaded. He is being invaded in a sense, and that he experiences it, without using that word, as a kind of rape. I mean, that she's taking, and he objects to it because she's a woman. Other male sages do it in other contexts, but they don't object. But a woman is taking possession of him. So I raised here the question of what we now call consent. She does this without asking his consent, and he really does not like it. I think maybe he has a point there. And she says that he shouldn't mind if he's a liberated person. If he's not, he would mind. But if he's liberated and realizes there is no difference between her and him, and varna doesn't matter and gender doesn't matter, then he shouldn't mind it, because they are having it's not sexual at all. Just because she's a woman and he's a man, that doesn't make it sexual. Yeah. And I think it's a little bit, to me, it sounded like it's a little bit about the intimacy of intellectual engagement, which we often don't pay. When you're closely intellectually engaged with someone and debating and discussing, there is an erotics to that, and that there's to that intimacy, and that can frighten people, right? It can be unnerving, and I think that's what he is, part of what he is objecting.
Right, and I think that she was also trying to show that even the thoughts, even that reaction you're having, you think it's your thoughts. You think this is what you're thinking, right? Because as you said earlier, in our tradition, the manas is the part of the body. It's not the atma and the manas are two different things. So the atma observes the manas, but it's that association and then the bonding that really is the problem. It's not a mere observation of the thought, right? That's what yoga is about, right? The idea of just observing your thoughts. I think Saulabha is trying to get him to the point to understand that even the idea of you thinking this is your thought, or that I'm invading your thought, is problematic, right? That shows you're not liberated.
Right. That shows he's not liberated.
Right. And which I thought it's such a beautiful conversation, because it just rips on its head what you would think would be, like, first of all, gender dynamics are thrown out the window. The whole concept of these varna dynamics, again, thrown out the window. It's a very raw conversation about what it really means to be a conscious being and engage with the world in a beautiful way. It's one of my favorite conversations, I think.
And there's another chapter on Ashtavakra and Disha. When Ashtavakra is a young man about to get married, he's sent off to learn from this female sage called Disha. And that's a fascinating conversation too, where he thinks he's impervious to desire, and she demonstrates to him that he is not. And then she finally at the end says that no one in the three worlds is impervious to desire, whether old or young, man or woman, no one is impervious to desire. You have to go beyond the three worlds to go beyond it. And he thought he was impervious because he's so scholarly and he's a sage, and then he realizes that he's not.
But she's like an old woman who takes on the form of a young woman, and then it's beautiful. I mean, that's also a great one, right?
Yeah.
Because I do think
Takes on the form of a young woman, now he starts seeing her as young and beautiful.
Sure.
That's ambiguous, which I think is wonderful, because at first he's repulsed by her when she makes advances to him, because he sees her as old and ugly. Then she starts cooking very delicious food for him, massaging him with soft hands, giving him beautiful beds and beautiful everything. And then he's so enjoying all of these things. So sensual erotic desire is not just about sex, it's about all the pleasures that you can have. And when he gets all that, then he suddenly sees her as young and beautiful. Now, maybe she has actually changed that to make him feel it's an illusion, or maybe he just sees her as that now, because now he's attracted to her. And then he considers, now I'm attracted to her, should I go ahead with it or not? And then he has to decide not to, because he's engaged to another woman, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think it's intimacy is about like protective vulnerability, right? He's in this place where he is vulnerable, but he feels protected and nurtured in that moment where suddenly that opens up the sense of like, oh, I can be attracted to this woman or whatever, you know. That I think is a very good point. For me, that story is also telling, because again, it goes to, I think many people feel like there's enlightenment's a place to get to here. Like you have this experience and you're enlightened suddenly. And like, I'm like, no, as long as this body exists and we're in this world, we're always going to be susceptible to the world, right? To kama, to all the desires and needs and wants. It doesn't go away.
I don't know. I guess people would differ on that. I'm not sure what I think, but I think many people think the one who is liberated here and now is, like, say, a guru, like Anandamayi Ma or somebody.
Yeah.
Is liberated even though living in the world, because they see themselves as everything and everything as them, right? So
yeah, I'm very bearish on that idea. I also come from a tradition, Vishishta Advaita, that doesn't accept Jivan Mukti, right? You know, you have to give up the body before Mukti is achieved. Yeah, I mean, the Advaita tradition has a strong perspective of Jivan Mukti. So what other stories or what other ideas in Dharma did you find to be really, really like maybe relevant for our day and time and what's going on, maybe in India or US or whatever?
I think all of it is, I mean, there's so many issues, but in all my chapters, I'm taking up things that are relevant. For example, the whole question of singleness, marriage, and desire. So I looked at various female sages who are single. I looked at Bhishma, who, interestingly, I also discovered this for the first time, that he is called, his enemies, they call him Tritiya Prakriti, which is the term Tritiya Prakriti for a man who desires a man, only for that. And because he is single, and he hasn't had children, this person contemptuously calls him Tritiya Prakriti, right? And Bhishma's whole engagement with Amba, who becomes Shikandini, who becomes Shikandin, that also, on rereading it, I just took a different view of this character, Amba, Shikandini, Shikandin, and also noticed how much she and Bhishma have in common. They both cross the boundaries of gender and marriage, etc. They both are playing with that in a way. They're both very strong, very powerful, and they are antagonists. But yeah, so that then I looked at the idea of parenting and masculinity, male parents basically, and sort of you see the range of different types of male parenting in the text. And then I looked at citizens, rulers, and nonviolence, and there's been a lot of recent scholarship on how wonderful Yudhishthira is and how he's the real hero of the text and how he's the hero who's being educated throughout. And I had a completely different view on reading it again, because he and Duryodhana seem to have a lot in common. They're both eldest sons who are thoroughly spoiled, and both of them at the drop of a hat are constantly saying that they will commit suicide.
That's true.
They don't get what they want. And Yudhishthira, at the end of the text, Krishna gets really fed up with him, and Vidura also, and they say that we have been repeatedly telling you that you can't be totally non-violent as long as you're alive. not possible. And certainly as a ruler, you can't be totally nonviolent. And Hinduism is not, unlike Jainism, is not, I think, committed to thoroughgoing nonviolence, despite Gandhi's ideas. I don't think it is. None of the. So they basically tell him that you have to be a good king. It's your duty and you owe it to people. And it's as a duty, not as for power, but as a duty, you have to do it. And you can't be thoroughly nonviolent. Having heard this from everybody, from Bhishma at great length, from Krishna, from everyone, and they're still he keeps rolling around on the ground and saying, I have to go after the sage, I have to give up this life, I have to commit suicide. He's very irritating to me by the end of the text, and a lot of other characters are irritated by him. Also, his nonviolence is not really thoroughgoing. For instance, I noticed this whole passage where he's really nasty and vicious to Arjuna and says, I wish you had never been born. And because he killed Karna yet, and he expected him to do it faster.
And he insults Gandiva at that point too.
Yeah, and he says, give it to somebody else. And he says, I wish you had never been born, or you had been aborted in the 5th month for an older sibling to a younger sibling. It's horrifying violence, I think. And then Arjuna, well, there's a whole series of things. Arjuna gives him some critiques him as well. But then Arjuna, who is always very tender to elders, he bursts into tears and falls at his feet and all that. And Yudhishthira kind of forgives him, but doesn't really apologize in the same way that Arjuna does. He doesn't regret or sorrow. So yeah, anyway, that was interesting. And then finally, my conclusion is about animals, about the treatment of non-human animals. And I looked at 3 debates there. Bhishma talking about animals and from 3 Varna perspectives, because Bhishma comes from a hunting, meat-eating group, but he does not think that meat-eating is the best thing. Quite the contrary. He thinks not eating meat is the best thing. And very interestingly, I noticed that he said something which is still there in India. He said that even if you're eating meat, only eat it in under 2 circumstances: if it has been offered as a sacrifice, or if you're eating meat, then during these periods don't eat it. And he says throughout the rainy season, gives various parts of the year, like what is Navratri, through those periods don't eat meat. And I have often noticed this in India, that meat-eating Hindus, much of the time they're not eating meat for various reasons. Once on different days, sometimes twice a week, on all kinds of festivals, during various festive periods. So that idea continues, and this is one reason why some recent major survey, I think it was a Pew survey, found that despite its huge population, India consumes much less meat than other countries with that population because of these habits. So this is, I think, as important as vegetarianism, or even more important, that you eat less. And then there's the Banya, who we talked about, the grocer who is thoroughgoing absolute, and that makes sense. That's the group that still is much more non-meat eating, right? The Jain and Hindu merchants and shopkeepers. So he's totally against any kind of violence to animals. And then there is the Vyadha, the hunter, butcher, meat seller, who also disapproves of it because he himself is a vegetarian. But he says due to his training, he has to support his parents, which of course is the trump card, that is what in India, to support your parents, you have to do anything. So he is supporting them by selling meat, but he doesn't kill the animals himself, and he doesn't eat meat. So these are the 3 perspectives. Of course, I'm summing up very simply. But what I've argued then is that kindness to animals, and that includes insects, birds, etc., is the dharma that is most available to all. Because however poor and a human being you are, you may not have power over other human beings, but you always have power over insects and some non-human beings. And you can choose to be kind or not there. And I've, in real life, encountered this in very interesting ways. Once I remember my goods were being moved, furniture was being moved, and there was this man from laborer from the street, picked up off the street, who was really down and out, not like any laborer, like regular laborers you see. He was really down and out, seemed really poor. And he was moving the furniture, and this big spider ran out, and I just wanted to kill it right away. I was at that time very, I think I've changed somewhat. I wanted to kill it right away. And he said, don't kill it. It also has to live. So that sentiment, that idea, I think, so this is what I mean by you don't have to be educated to have these feelings and ideas that come from a tradition.
Right. It in my life too, it's like that, similar. Like my wife, if she sees a spider or insect, it's like, kill it. And I'll go get a piece of paper and take it and try to put it outside, because for me, I'm like, it's needless killing. It's trying to just live its life. It's not like I need to eat it or anything like that. It's needless.
Exactly. And then my last last chapter is about the Bhakta poets, the devotional medieval poets like Kabir and Tulsidas and Meera and Raidas. And there I'm showing through their poetry how they draw on ideas from the epics. Because often it is made out as if they are in revolt against the entire Sanskritic tradition. And I don't think that's true at all, including Kabir. And I focused on Kabir because Kabir has been picked up as some sort of rejecting the entire tradition. It's not at all true. Kabir uses all these terms: karma, rebirth, ideas, doctrines. He has poetry of mystical love for, he talks about Ram, he talks about, and Ram not just as the all that, he actually talks about Ram. And he talks about Vaishnavas, he talks about not eating animals, he talks, many of the ideas, and say Ravidas, who was from a Shudra background, right? He has this many poems, but this long song in which he lists all the bhaktas. And I found that fascinating because he lists all the bhaktas, starting with Vidura, Krishna, the Pandavas, etc., and coming down through time to his own contemporaries and Kabir and to the So he sees in this cosmic scale no difference between the characters who are bhaktas in the Mahabharata or the Ramayana and Hanuman and everybody, and the characters who are living people in his own or earlier than him. So he sees them all as bhaktas. They live in this universe of devotion. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. And there has been this really, I think, when I read this literature around a lot of the Bhakti movement, especially when it comes to people like say Kabir or Ravidas or even to some sense in Guru Nanak, right? It's or the Sikh tradition. It's as if it's a break from the tradition that existed before, and I just see it as just a different stream that's entirely connected to it, right? It's just because like they're not when like Guru Nanak talks about Narasimha or Prahlad, he's not talking about in some imaginary Prahlad. He's talking about this tradition of Prahlad, right? And the same goes for all these. When they say Rama, it's not Rama like just Ram Rahim kind of thing. It's Rama Dasharatha Putra.
Right. And also, most importantly, what the bhaktas are often praised for, which is this focus on non-difference, on oneness. There's no difference between different communities, different so-called, between different varnas, between gender, etc. Yes, they espouse that idea, and that idea is not an invention of theirs. I've tried to demonstrate that. The others have demonstrated. It's in the epic. There are the characters saying exactly that. Now, it's a debate. Not everyone in the epics agrees with this, but among the bhaktas also there are many who don't agree with it. Some agree with it, some don't. So this is the continuing debate about difference and non-difference, which is there in many texts, including the bhaktas. It's not something they invented at all.
But I think that also the telling thing about a lot of these Bhakti poets and writers and lyricists is, even though they come from these various communities, it appears very clear to me they're very intelligent, educated people in some sense, right? They know a lot of, not only about like the stories, but the philosophies, which are not easy to understand.
Yeah, the meaning. Yeah, Rahim, Kabir, Ravidas, Tulsi, of course. I mean, they're all deeply rooted in the tradition. However, technically educated they may or may not have been, they are very deeply immersed in all these in the texts. They know the stories and the meaning of the stories very well. It's not mythology for them.
No, it's life.
Narratives which have meaning. They're not just stories. They have philosophical significance. Yeah.
Absolutely. I also know you have stuff to do and you might have to go soon. But is there any like anything else that you think this book that you want to discuss that would really stands out to you?
I guess we've briefly covered it all. It started out in one way and ended up being something else through my reading. Ended up going in a different direction through my reading.
So how did this start out for you? Actually, can we talk briefly when you first started this project, what was your thoughts? And then where did where do your thoughts end up?
Well, I taught the Gita many times to university students, and I developed an understanding of it over time. It changed. And then I had also written various essays on Ashtavakra and Saulabha, etc. And I thought of bringing them together and doing something. But when I reread the Mahabharata and other texts, I just, the Ramcharitmanas, for example, I started seeing and making connections. And then it developed into this. And then this conclusion that kindness to animals is the universal dharma. It is the Dharma, and it is central in the Mahabharata and to some extent the Ramayana too, especially to animals, not to other humans, but especially to non-human animals. And that is the Dharma available to all. And that you see that in stories in the text as well as in debates in the text. That is what was very illuminating to me. It was something I thought I found that I wasn't fully aware of in the text. So there are many stories, like the story of Markandeya, right? Realizes that he is he's like a bacteria in the stomach of Krishna. That's our smallness in the universe. And so looking at things from animal perspectives, from insect perspectives, from even bacteria's perspective, this is very fascinating because, and then there's a whole debates on hunting, debates on capturing, debates on living in Montana. I'm very familiar with these debates. So these debates on hunting, debates on torturing animals by overworking them, taking the children away from the mother, the calves away from the cows, torturing bullocks and making them. All of these questions arise in stories as well as debates in the Mahabharata. So that was another sort of.
So let me ask you a question. I mean, your degree was in English, right? So you've studied a wide gamut of English literature on the whole, correct? So do you find a lot of these kind of conversations that occur in English literature?
Yes, but not to the same extent. And what I'm interested in English literature in this context, I'm interested in many things in English literature, but in this context, is the way these ideas come to the West in the 18th century. That's when the Gita is translated in 1785 and the Puranas and the Upanishads and everything. Then writers in English read it. Percy Shelley, for example, became a vegetarian partly because of reading these, which was immensely difficult to do in the early 19th century England. He partly due to this reading in Indian philosophy. Thoreau tried to be a vegetarian and to a large extent was, after he read all of these texts. So there is a circulation of ideas where these Indian ideas pervade the writings of Romantic poets and Transcendentalist poets, writers who become very popular during the 19th century and then affect other people. And then you have the vegetarian societies and Henry Salt and all those people who influenced Gandhi. When Gandhi was a vegetarian by birth, but when he went to England, he discovered the meaning behind that vegetarianism. So you have a full circulation of the Indian ideas going to the West, coming back to India in another form, with another discourse, a more developed discourse for ordinary people who haven't read the Mahabharata,
right?
And things like that. So I find that very fascinating. Not only, I've also written on rebirth in that context. So not only the idea of vegetarianism, but the idea of rebirth, which comes from India to the West and back to India, in other times. Yeah. It's always there.
So I think it's very interesting. Sorry, one sec. Hold on a second. So what's so interesting to me about a large part of this is not just the nature of like rebirth coming back and forth. It's also like how Gandhi's ahimsa changed, right? Like it's different from the Hindu ahimsa that's built into the Gita. Do you have a sense that came from his version of the Gita came from the West to him?
I don't know about that, but I do know this idea of nonviolence, as you said, is very different from the Hindu idea of nonviolence. It's affected by Jainism, but it's also deeply Christian. I think very much, which he acknowledged, very much influenced by Christianity. He reads the Gita as a text recommending nonviolence, which is interesting and fascinating, but is ultimately not convincing at all.
No.
So not convinced by so that Hinduism is an entirely nonviolent religion or is always espousing nonviolence is not at all true. Nonviolence to animals, it's not even not all of Hinduism is recommending it. Jainism does. Yeah. But to animals, I think Gandhi's ideas on animals to me are the most Indian of his Hindu and Jain and most Indian element in his idea of nonviolence, because it's not there to that extent in the Western idea of nonviolence. In the Western idea of nonviolence and rebirth, it's all about humans.
Right.
Born as humans and humans should be non-violent to each other. But Gandhi has a real commitment to non-violence to animals. And I think that's, for me, is the Indian strain in his thinking. As far as humans are concerned, his idea that we should always be non-violent and sort of, it sounds to me very Yudhishthira-like, and is not supported by the body of Hindu texts.
It's not supported in the Mahabharata by anybody else, right? Krishna, Bhima, Vyasa, Arjuna, even at the end. Yeah. they all say this is idiotic. Like Arjuna's comment to Yudhishthira was, every second you're breathing in, you're committing violence, right? All these invisible things you're destroying. So you can't fundamentally live a non-violent life.
The logical conclusion of that type of non-violence is suicide.
Yeah.
And Yudhishthira is very attracted to. So
which is Jainas, which they do that.
Yeah, and what Gandhi was also recommending to many groups, he said that let Hitler like kill you, allow, not realizing that Hitler is not going to be convinced, but is not going to have a change of this, right? But he was recommending collective suicide to various communities, right?
Yeah, which within the Indian tradition you would never, I mean, within the Hindu tradition you would never say, because the idea, even on non-violence, ahimsa, or even anirshamshaya, you have to use that within, even when you commit violence, try to be non-violent in that commitment of violence, right? Because
violence also includes not being violent to yourself. Krishna
right.
says, he says, don't torture. I love this verse where he says, don't torture the body because I am in the body, right?
Right.
So the body is not to be despised, and I think to some extent Gandhi did despise the body. The body is not to be despised. Sex, desire, the body are very much part of Hindu thought, and that's a major difference from ascetic inclined religions like
Buddhism and Jainism.
Of Christianity, yeah. So he says, don't torture the body. Like, and I've noticed that Hindu fasts, rarely is there an all-day fast, and never more than one day fast. And when there's fast like Navratri and all, you're still eating quite tasty things on it. You're not torturing the body, and I fully agree. I mean, that I like that. I don't think that torturing the body by inflicting, flagellating, self-flagellating, which a lot of Christian ascetics and other religions, etc., do. Hinduism doesn't recommend extreme.
It doesn't recommend, but we do have a strain of people that take on these crazy vrats, right? Keeping your hand up for
That explicitly condemns all that. Those who are torturing their bodies are torturing me in the body, and that's a form of demonic. Now we may or may not agree with that, but that's what the Gita says.
Right. No, it's fascinating. So do you have any, it's what else are you working on now? Like, with your time now not being a professor, I'm sure you have more time to do the things that interest you.
Well, I brought this book of poems has just come out, and there are meditations. I've translated some Bhakti poems, I've translated Ravidas, and also my own poems, thinking about migration, about reading Tulsidas in Montana. These are things that are some of the things that are going on here. And I have a second novel in press, and I've put together a collection of translations of Hindi fiction, 100 years of Hindi fiction on same-sex desire. That's in press, and I'm now working on Shakespeare.
Very, very nice. I mean, this is awesome. I mean, so is there any last things you kind of want to say to our audience about either your work that you've done, or like, whatever's going on and what you think can, be important for them to think about?
Not really. I'd like this book to be more discussed. It seems to have not been widely reviewed yet. And I think when you publish with an academic press, it may intimidate general readers. But I do want to say this written in very simple language, the way I've been talking.
But I also think it's the price. So someone, I can afford like $80 or something. But I think it's very high priced.
Very high priced. And I realize you have no control over the price. The publishers just do what they want. And that's an academic press. I think in future I've published a lot with trade presses, and I think I'll do that because they keep the price reasonable. So what people could do is to ask their libraries to buy it, the local public university library. And it's written without theoretical, I never write, I don't use what's called theory. I don't write in any kind of academic jargon. So it's perfectly accessible to the general reader. I'd like it to be more discussed and to get more feedback on it. That would be nice.
No, absolutely. So, I'll link it up into our show notes, and I give them access to maybe the Amazon or whatever, so they can purchase it. Or do you have a preferred place for them to buy it from?
Amazon's good. If Amazon's more affordable, usually they give a discount.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll put your website and your information all in here. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, how do they reach out to you?
They can email me at ruth.vanita@umontana.edu. ruth.vanita@umontana.edu.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Vanita, thank you so much for your time and your consideration, and I truly appreciate the great work you've done, not only for the espousing Hindu literature and ideas, but also for the LGBTQ and the women everywhere. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, bye.
Gayati Vanamali वनमाली मधुरं गायति वनमाली